Hi, everyone. I just ran across the building, so excuse me. Today, we have a really special guest who is going to be talking about woodwind doubling. So, clarinetist Dr. David Yandl brings a unique sensitivity to standard repertoire and contemporary works. Active as a solo, chamber, and orchestral musician, he has performed at New York's Carnegie Hall, Chicago's Symphony Center, and at festivals in the US and Europe. Recent highlights include Mozart's Clarinet Concerto with the New York Symphonic Arts Ensemble and chamber music performances at the Aurora Chamber Music Festival in Vänersborg, Sweden. David was a semifinalist in the 2006 Fischoff National Chamber Music Competition, and his performances have been broadcast on WFMT 98.7 Chicago. As an orchestral musician, David performs frequently with the Grand Rapids and West Michigan Symphonies and was an associate member of the Civic Orchestra of Chicago. He has also performed with the Boise Philharmonic, Concertante di Chicago, Holland Symphony, Jackson Symphony, Pennsylvania Center Orchestra, and the West Point Band. An accomplished multi-instrumentalist, David performs recital, orchestral, and musical theater repertoire on a range of woodwind instruments. During an 8-week run as woodwind soloist in Lawrence Mark Wythe's Tomorrow Morning the Musical, the show is named Critics' Pit by the Chicago Tribune. He regularly performs in theatrical productions at the International Festival of the Voice in New York alongside veterans of the Metropolitan Opera and Broadway stages. In demand as an educator, David is currently Assistant Professor of Music and Music Program Director at Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Other appointments include faculty positions at DePaul University, Michigan State University, Alma College, and Hope College. A passionate advocate for music as an agent of social change, David has taught in tuition-free programs for underserved urban youth in Chicago, including Project SOAR and El Sistema affiliate Yours. David holds bachelor's and master's degrees from DePaul University and a Doctor of Musical Arts from Michigan State University. He completed additional studies at Universidad Alfonso El Sabio, sorry, I should have checked this, in Madrid, Spain. Important teachers and mentors include Larry Combs, Julie DeRoche, Yehuda Gilad, Theodore Owen, and John Bruce Ye. So thank you so much for being here. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to meet all of you tonight and get to share a little bit about what I do. So as she just read my entire bio, which was really great to hear. So my career has kind of been on a few different tracks. Most of my training has been like classical clarinet training, but I've also done a lot of work that requires me to play other instruments and sometimes in other styles too. So I just want to share a little bit about what that has been like for me and maybe give some practical advice if some of you are looking to get started in that yourselves. Whenever I give a class like this, and it's for students who are enrolled full-time in college, it always comes with a little bit of a warning because you already have like a really fabulous teacher, like a really high caliber clarinet teacher. And there's no replacing that relationship you get over 4 or more years working with that person. So any advice that I give is, subject to the considerations of your teacher, right? I think that's really important that any guests, I guess I can only speak for myself, that, take it with a grain of salt. That's especially true for a class like this because we're going to talk about a lot of things that might consume time or build habits away from your primary instrument. So even more so, just take that into consideration. You always want to consult your primary teacher who's developing your skills in a really important way. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And has it been successfully shared? Folks can see the outline of the day. Awesome. So, woodwind doubling from the clarinetist perspective. What is meant by woodwind doubling? So, for this kind of lecture today, we're not really going to include other members of the clarinet family. Like, I'm not really talking about when you're asked to play bass clarinet or E flat clarinet or everyone's favorite, the contrabass clarinet. I'm talking about saxophone, flute, double reeds. So, instruments from other families outside the clarinet family. And it's good to consider that this might include non-Western historical or folk instruments. So composers and orchestrators are getting more and more adventurous all the time. And so it's really not unusual to be asked to play recorder or a tin whistle, or maybe a historical instrument. Um, so things like Cirque du Soleil, their touring shows ask for duduk, which is an Armenian instrument. Some of the Harry Potter soundtracks that are going around ask for crumhorn and some historical things and recorder in there too. So again, we're not talking about really clarinet family, all the other stuff. So number two here, why do it? Why bother taking on another instrument, right? I think one instrument is in many ways hard enough and gives us so much to do. But the first reason is that there are more opportunities to perform. So, as many of you probably already know, asking one performer to play multiple woodwinds is standard practice for musical theater orchestration. So, that's typically grouped into one book for each player called a reed book. There's usually between 1 and 4 reed books in a show, and each reed book will call usually between 2 and 5 instruments for each player. Traditionally, they're organized by pitch level in a rough way. So, like reed 1, that reed book might be for flute, piccolo, and oboe. Reed 2 might be for clarinets, alto sax, and tenor sax. Reed 3 might be for tenor sax and bass clarinet, and so on. So they might be grouped together. I say traditionally because that practice has started to fade and might go away entirely. So again, composers and orchestrators are getting more adventurous and more demanding all the time. So recent shows I've played, for example, Fun Home. If anyone knows that musical, if you don't, you should check it out. That read book was flute, clarinet, tenor sax, bass clarinet, English horn. So all over the map, just in that one book. Besides the musical theater read books, big band, for those of you who have big band experience, you know that you'll sometimes be asked to play more than one. Studio musicians as well, those who do recording sessions for commercials or video games, sometimes as part of their living, they'll be asked to play more than one instrument. And there are rare instances of sort of legit repertoire, just classical repertoire, straight ahead repertoire, that actually asks you to pick up a different instrument, things for the concert stage. So the original Rhapsody in Blue actually has reed doubles in it. So Gershwin wrote it almost more like a big band chart. The one that people often play now was reorchestrated by someone else. But if you do ever play the original, there are parts that call for clarinet and alto sax and clarinet and tenor sax with the same player. There's a great piece called Concerto for Clarinet and Orchestra, also for wind band, by Jeff Beal. And this is a great one to look into if you're interested because it has clarinet in one movement and soprano sax in another movement of the same piece. And there's also a wonderful recording of this piece by my former teacher, by Larry Combs. Another great resource if you're looking for sort of legitimate repertoire that wants more than one instrument is Brett Pimentel's website. The link's here. And he has a pretty exhaustive list of works that ask for one player to double. And then the last sort of opportunity that comes from doubles is orchestral pops concerts. So even though you may not be asked to play different instruments in the same piece, if you are able to fill in on saxophone or something else, they'll sometimes include you in that on an orchestra job, just because it makes life easier for the contractor, not to have to hire as many people. Another important part of this, which is good to know, is this often comes with financial benefits as well. So depending on your locale and how strictly the union rules are followed, typically when you're asked to pick up a second instrument, that will give you an increase in pay. So a typical situation is to get 30% over the normal per service rates for the first double, and then 10% for each double after that. So it can add up pretty quickly if you're playing, 4, 5, 6 instruments in a show. Other reasons why you might want to get into doubling: there are more opportunities to teach. So definitely opening up your private studio to other instruments can be really beneficial if you feel you're comfortable and confident on a second instrument. And there are small university music programs that hire professors to teach multiple woodwinds. So that's the position actually that I'm in now, where I'm teaching multiple woodwinds here at Cornerstone University. So this next one, you notice I've bolded, and it's really one of my main points for today in terms of why I would encourage people to double. And it's for just artistic development. Whether or not you're interested in teaching a second instrument, whether or not you're interested in ever playing it in public, having another outlet to explore music can really add some richness to your life. So picking up a second instrument can help you gain insights and awareness that can just enhance your music making on your primary instruments, on the clarinet, or overall. Um, Getting to explore how you make sounds in another instrument can help you unlock some physical and technical breakthroughs on your primary instrument. So when you pick up that secondary instrument, it's going to ask different things of you, and it might show where you hold tension in your body, or a certain habit that you have that you may not have been aware of otherwise. It's also very good for your ear to develop a relationship with the sound of another instrument. Every woodwind instrument has its own tendencies, whether they be for pitch or dynamic or articulation. And sometimes we can be complacent about those on the clarinet or whatever our primary instrument is. We sometimes can start to lose touch with the fact that certain notes will land sharp, or things like that. So having another instrument can sometimes bring to the fore what the tendencies on your primary instrument are, and bring them to your awareness in a new way. It also can be really good for performance psychology. I think each of us gets a little dose of this in class piano, knowing how strong mentally you have to be to perform on an instrument that's not your primary instrument, that's not something you spend hours and hours on. And I think that can only make you stronger as a performer overall. You also can explore different repertoire on the original instruments. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. If you hear a flute piece and you think this is just really moving and I want to play it, why not? Why not explore that for your own benefit? You can definitely be an informed colleague, conductor, and composer. Knowing the tendencies of a different instrument really well can help you play with others in a section better. Certainly as a conductor, will help you understand what's being asked of the different instrumentalists. And certainly if you're interested in composing, having some facility on different instruments will definitely inform what you do as a composer. And you'll get the opportunity to work with different teachers. So I've had the opportunity to work with, of course, a lot of clarinet teachers, but also oboe and flute and saxophone. And some of the things I've learned from those teachers on secondary instruments have just been really helpful musical concepts that I probably wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise. So again, even if I hadn't really aspired to play in musical theater pits or any of these other things, it's really benefited me artistically to delve into these other instruments. So number 3, caveats or warnings. And this goes back to what I was saying at the top of the hour. You really want to consult your teacher before you make a commitment to spending time on another instrument. Um, so I can tell the story that I played in high school and community productions a lot and loved it. And then I showed up to my undergraduate audition and I finished playing the Weber Concertino. And someone on the committee, the first thing they said was, "Do you play saxophone? Because you sound like a saxophonist playing clarinet." So at that time, it was really recommended that I just focus on clarinet. Um, and for me, that was the right choice. So I would encourage all of you again to take the advice of your current teacher and decide, is it the right time for you to explore other instruments? Is this going to take you away from clarinet playing at a time when that's not a great idea, or not? So it is definitely a time commitment. If you're going to start, getting in shape to play in public, then you kind of have to keep it up. So that's a bigger time commitment. And maintaining all the reeds and equipment is also a time commitment. So it's important to keep that in mind. If you're still in a place where you're building good habits on your primary instruments, it can interfere with that. We'll talk a little bit more later, but that's just, again, something to keep in mind. Is this the right time for you individually? It also carries an increased risk of overuse injury. So the muscles that we use to play musical instruments are quite small and delicate and are easily injured over repeated use, even just on one instrument. If we add in a second and a third instrument, we have to tend to our well-being and our health even more acutely. That the risk for developing issues with your wrist or your jaw or things like that really compound with each instrument that you add, because you're asking even more of these very small, delicate muscles. The last thing to consider too is the cost. I don't think you have to go out and buy professional quality instruments to get into doubling at all. But there will eventually come costs, at least with reeds and mouthpieces and things like that. So I'm going to keep in mind. All right. So if you've considered all of these things and you think it's a good time to jump in, where to start? So if you're a clarinetist and you're looking at picking up a secondary instrument, alto saxophone is probably the best place for you to go. As a clarinetist, this is the thing that you would probably be most commonly asked to play. And I would say the same thing for a saxophonist. If you're a saxophonist, probably clarinet would be the next logical choice for you. Just identifying some things that might throw you if you're a clarinet player who's picking up the saxophone for the first time. So probably the most important difference we want to distinguish between saxophone and clarinet is voicing. So I'm sure we're all learning like a really great sense of tongue position and voicing, where we keep the air moving quite quickly into the clarinet throughout the entire range. With the saxophone, we do need to change the voicing throughout the different registers. So that's something that, well, the mouthpiece is shaped similarly and the instruments are in the same family, this is probably the first difference we want to wrap our heads around, is the changes in voicing. So the way that you play a very low note on the saxophone is actually quite different in terms of tongue position than the way you play a very high note. Fingerings, of course, are going to be different. And there's not just different fingerings in terms of different pitches, but a slightly different system. So clarinet players picking up the saxophone have to contend with these right here, the left-hand palm keys, and also our left-hand pinky right here has these spatulas to operate. So the bulk of the range of the instrument will feel quite similar to your clarinet. You'll have 3 holes on top and 3 holes on bottom, and you'll be able to play diatonically that way, the same way you do in your clarinet, and it actually matches the clarion register. So all 6 fingers down, and the register key is a D, just like on your clarinet. But these palm keys up here and these pinky spatulas are things we just don't have on the clarinet, so that's going to take some time to adjust to. With the saxophone, some of the lowest notes tend to be a problem area for a lot of saxophonists. And this is counterintuitive, I think, to most clarinetists. Like, we start learning notes just at the bottom of the treble clef staff. So, a note like printed middle C on the clarinet is something you learned right away in 5th or 6th grade. On the saxophone, this can be a real challenge because of the difference in voicing. So that's something you want to start tackling from the start. Let me get going on the next page here. All right, other differences or other challenges with saxophone, Altissimo. So the system for playing Altissimo on saxophone is actually totally different to that on clarinet, right? We all know that to cross over into the Altissimo on clarinet, we just lift our first finger in the left hand, and that vents up to the next register, and we continue up the scale. The system of playing Altissimo on the saxophone is really a system of false harmonics. This wasn't really standard practice on the saxophone until even like the 1960s or 70s did people and composers start to demand lots of high notes on the saxophone. Luckily for us, it's not called for too much in musical theater writing, but it's not a bad idea to get your eyes on some Altissimo exercises as you get started. And then finally, vibrato. So on saxophone, vibrato is standard technique. It's kind of expected that you would play vibrato quite often in a way that we wouldn't on clarinet. So there's all the challenges, there's all the sort of problems when we go from clarinet to saxophone. What do I recommend? So I'll say this a lot tonight: long tones, harmonics, and scales. They are your friends. So you already have an innate musicianship and a musicianship that you're developing in terms of being able to play complex sequences of notes and rhythms, but you want to make friends with this new instrument and get to understand its behavior. So simple things like long tones and harmonics and scales are going to probably pack the most punch for you. As we mentioned before, you want to identify differences in voicing. So the tuner is your friend, and feeling the difference in vowel sound between the E of the clarinet and the slightly more ah of the saxophone. Lots of time spent playing these lowest notes that use these pinky keys, and some of the highest notes that use these palm keys are really good. And then I want to give you just one exercise. So I'm not going to go in depth this evening on how to play every single instrument, but I will just kind of give you one of my highlights or one of my favorite exercises on each horn. So if you're new to saxophone and you want to start developing vibrato, we're going to do that using our jaw. Saxophone uses jaw vibrato, which is different to some of the other woodwinds. And the speech syllable that works for most people is VOO, like VOO. So to get started with vibrato on saxophone, I'm going to say VOO in a rhythmic way. VOO, 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 VOO. And then I'll do that on the saxophone. And we can hear just one undulation in that vibrato per beat there. And I can double that. Voo, 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 voo. And double it, and then 16ths. Voo, 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 voo. And voo, 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 voo. And then you can hear by the end of it that I'm on my way to developing a semblance of vibrato there. So that's my kind of one takeaway exercise for the saxophone. Next piece of advice is to really consider the style. So most of us as clarinet players go off to college, and unless we're doing like a jazz studies degree or something, we play Mozart's, Weber, Brahms. We might study some orchestral excerpts if we're so inclined, but it's really geared towards classical music. There, of course, are also classical saxophonists who are playing Glazunov and Ibert and lots of contemporary music, but neither of those things are really the kind of things that woodwind doublers are often asked to do. So there is traditionally sort of like a musical theater style or a Broadway style, but of course, musicals now encompass a whole range of jazz and popular styles. Um, so the things that you might do that are sort of classically oriented may not have a place in musical theater. You may be asked to do a whole different range of skills like growling and pitch bends and different styles of articulation. So it's a good idea to start educating yourself about jazz if you don't have any jazz experience, because trying to transfer your classical clarinet experience to saxophone could be really beautiful, but not necessarily appropriate to the style of the particular show that you're being asked to do. And then just some practical tips there for equipment. Reeds, as we know, as clarinetists, Van Doren or D'Addario, I can really recommend. For playing musical theater pits, I think Leger, especially on alto saxophone, is great. So that's probably one of the things that's benefited theater musicians the most in the past couple of decades is the popularity and the availability of Leger reeds. They really make life a lot easier if you're in a pit. So finding a strength that works well for you can really be a lifesaver. Mouthpieces, for clarinetists who are going to double, I like the Selmer C Star a lot. So there is a whole range of different mouthpieces for different styles. There are definitely jazz mouthpieces out there as well. Most people coming from clarinet have a hard time controlling those. They're just so different to what you're used to. And a Selmer C Star is just a really versatile mouthpiece that works for both classical and jazz and will feel, as much as a saxophone can, somewhat similar to what you're used to on clarinet. Second to that, I think the Van Doren AL3 can be a good option. Instruments themselves, Yamaha and Selmer are kind of the two leading brands. There's an up-and-coming brand called Chateau that I can really recommend as well. And you definitely want to invest in a great neck strap. A lot of times if you're just starting out on saxophone, your saxophone comes with like really the cheapest possible neck strap, and it can be very uncomfortable and problematic to play. So I really like this one, Neotech. People who are classical saxophonists or concert saxophonists sometimes invest in really great like braces and harnesses and things. And those are good, but maybe not the best thing for doublers because we have to contend with quick changes. So those braces that sort of attach right here or have, something that goes over the shoulder or something like that can be really ergonomic and great, but not necessarily practical for a pit. On to flute. So that would be my next recommendation after clarinet and saxophone is going on to flute. And for most people, this will present a brand new set of challenges and probably more challenges just because the function of the instrument, the way it produces sound is so different, right? So on flute, we're dealing with low wind resistance, very low wind resistance, less than clarinet, less than saxophone. So the sensation that most clarinet players encounter when they switch to flute is feeling like their air just escapes too quickly. So learning how to breathe deeply and keep your rib cage and diaphragm expanded for a long period of time is probably the most important skill there. There's low wind resistance, but high wind consumption, meaning playing a long phrase is significantly more challenging on the flute. So working on your lung capacity in an organized way, meaning it might even start with playing 4 beats at a certain tempo on the metronome, and then aim for 5, and then aim for 6, is a good thing to do. Fingerings, of course, are a little different than clarinet, but they're actually quite similar to saxophone. So making that switch from flute to saxophone, it gets a little easier the more you learn these fingerings. The embouchure is also obviously very, very different. So as classically trained clarinetists, we learn a quite muscular, strong, and firm embouchure, right? You know, with a chin pulled nice and flat and all these things, which does wonders for the clarinet, but does not for the flute. So learning to let go here is going to be one of our biggest challenges as clarinet players going to flutes. And the ways that we sometimes try to gain control of our clarinet sound are not going to work on the flute at all. The extreme ranges of the flute, again, can be really problematic. Again, some of those lowest notes will have a tendency not to speak for beginning players. So it's going to take some time to build up your low register and build up your high register. We also use vibrato on flute, but it's different. It's a diaphragm vibrato. And flutists in advanced settings are expected to triple and double tongue. Probably not totally necessary for most shows, but it's a good thing to have on your radar if you want to go really far with flutes. I think there are a lot of benefits really for everyone spending time with the flute, whether or not you intend to perform or teach it. Being able to produce a good sound on the flute is going to do wonders for your breathing across all the woodwinds. It really demands so much in terms of breath supports that I can really recommend it for everyone just to kind of experiment with that. And there will be some things that can transfer to your clarinet playing for sure. The next one is relaxation, and this is huge. So many of the habits that we develop as clarinet players, where we sometimes carry tension in our jaw, we carry tension in our neck, in our throat, around our voice box, will not be tolerated by the flute. You'll find that notes just simply won't speak because of the amount of tension that you might carry. And transferring that to your clarinet playing is just going to even open it up in a positive way even more. So the flute can be a real good reality check in terms of how tense are we, because sometimes the clarinet lets us get away with a lot of tension that we really shouldn't. And flexibility. The flute, again, asks us to stay nice and flexible right here. And I think that's a good thing not to lose that, even though our clarinet embouchures, it tends to be pretty rigid. So if you're on your path to being a doubler and you're picking up the flute, I always recommend to start the day with flutes. The embouchure is most relaxed and most supple. And if you start the day with a long session of clarinet practice or a long session of, saxophone or some other instruments, it might not be entirely possible to get that flexibility back or get it back in the way that you want. So if you're going to be doing a lot of doubling, I usually like to start the day with flutes, even if it's a short session, just so I can kind of check in with that nice flexibility that I want. Again, long tones, harmonics, and scales are really important. And this is actually a good point to address what harmonics are. So clarinet players don't often do this. Once in a while we hear about it, but other woodwind players, especially flutists and saxophonists, will play multiple notes from one fingering just by adjusting their airspeed and embouchure. So if I finger, say, an F on the flute, I can play all registers just on that one fingering. And they're not necessarily in tune. Those aren't the real fingerings I would use, but they're an important tool in getting to know the instrument. Again, because tension tends to be such an issue with clarinet players moving to flute, I really recommend to sing and play or to hum and play. And that's actually doing both at the same time. So I'm vocalizing ooh. And other than being just kind of a cool trick, it's a real good check for how tense are we here, right? So we have a little bit of mobility inside here around our voice box. If you imagine that you're going to scream, like there's the most high-pitched, blood-curdling scream, but don't let it out. You can feel your vocal mechanism, your pharynx go, ugh, and push way up, right? And sometimes we get in the habit of doing that as clarinet players or as woodwind players in general. And that sing and play exercise is a really good one to make sure that we're nice and relaxed here and we're not forcing our voice box up with too much tension. Developing a tone concept on flute can be really tricky. It's not physically inside our head, inside our mouth like the other instruments are. And so the sound that we hear can be quite different than the sound that's out in the hall. So I recommend that you record yourself and play for others on flute for sure. And vibrato. So we talked about vibrato on saxophone. Vibrato on flute is from our diaphragm. So rather than a voo, voo, voo kind of syllable, I always like huh, 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 huh. Developing vibrato that way. Definitely get started on those Altissimo fingerings. It's not a false harmonic system like on the saxophone, but they are totally different than clarinet, and they're not following a sort of sequential ordering of the fingers. And flutes, unlike saxophones, flutes really live up there. So things written above the staff, playing even a B flat, 5 or 7 ledger lines above the staff is just normal on the flute and expected. So it's a good idea to get comfortable with those fingerings right away. Things that would just seem like, oh my gosh, that's such a high note on the clarinet, really aren't on flute. They're just standard range. I can really recommend the practice book by Trevor Y. It's called Practice Book for the Flute. It comes in 6 volumes. You can buy all 6 in one. And that's probably the most comprehensive resource on flute fundamentals around. There are even versions of it that come with a CD that are really, really good. Equipment, I really like flutes by Yamaha, Azumi, and Trevor James. And one that can be really nice for doublers is Gemeinhardt's Black Nickel Flute. It's a pretty inexpensive instrument and it has a pretty powerful sound compared to most student flutes. So that can be a really great one to have. I'll talk more about this later, but in terms of making an investment in instruments, I think flute benefits the most. Those of you who have flute experience or have flutist friends know that flutes can get really pricey. And a lot of times you're paying for material, you're paying for solid silver or even solid gold or gold plating. And it does actually make a difference, even more so than the difference between like a wood and a plastic clarinet. So getting the most solid silver on your flute is gonna help you along. There's a device that I can really recommend. It's called the Numo Pro. And this is made for teaching young flutists, but it's really great for everyone. I've talked to professionals who say they use this as well. You can see it's sort of like a yellow plastic head joint. And there's a row of fans on the outside. And it's for embouchure training and air direction. So you can put it on and aim your air direction at the different fans. And this is a very helpful thing for flutists at all levels. One thing that can trip us up is the diameter of the instrument is a lot smaller, really, than all the others. It's certainly smaller than a clarinet, smaller than a saxophone, even smaller than an oboe. So for our left hand, this can start to feel quite cramped or pinched, holding on to something that's so much smaller than our clarinet. So a lot of clarinetists switching to flute benefit from some sort of device here. The sort of cheapest one that's available is called Bow Pep. It's, I think, maybe like 10 bucks, and it just clips on your flute here and just provides a little bit more comfort for those of us used to holding something bigger. You have to be careful with this. It can scratch your flute, so watch out for that. Other one that I mentioned there is called Selexa. That's a little bit more expensive and geared more towards professional flutists, but they offer options for resting your left hand and also options for resting your right hand, little things that attach and can really help with that. Moving on to oboe. So I noticed I put sought after in musical theater. Oftentimes people who pursue musical theater as a living start as jazz saxophonists, and they'll pick up clarinet and flutes, but double reed players are sometimes hard to find. So common challenges for clarinetists switching to oboe are sort of the opposite of flute. It's going to offer very high wind resistance and very low wind consumption. So it's going to feel very stuffy to play, and it's only going to take a little bit of air. So you'll be able to play great long phrases and not run out of air. But for those of you who have any oboe experience, know you'll end up with some spent air in your lungs that you have to get rid of between phrases. The next thing to keep in mind is unique to the oboe, the half hole. So it's just standard practice that oboes have for this first finger, a hole with a little, or a key touch with a little hole in it, and then a platform next to it. And we need to get good at rolling back and forth here, either covering the hole or just onto the little platform. And this is not something we typically do on clarinet or on flute or saxophone, this kind of rolling motion here. Other things to keep in mind is attacks. On clarinet, we're blessed with this instrument that can create these beautiful soft attacks, and it comes quite naturally. The oboe with so much resistant attacks will tend to burst out on us. And then reeds. So I'll talk more about this later, but getting a handle on reeds, especially when it's not your primary instrument, can be a big challenge. I also think there's a lot of benefits, again, for experimenting with oboe that can help your clarinet playing. The first one is support. So the kind of resistance you have to combat on the oboe can really help the way that you support on clarinet, for sure. It also takes an incredible amount of embouchure strength to play the oboe well. So it's a different embouchure, and we're not maybe held quite so taut, but it's going to use these muscles here in a way that we would want to use them on clarinet as well. It has similar voicing, which is nice, so we're still going to be keeping that nice high tongue position. And oboe is really great for pitch awareness. The double reeds have a flexibility to them that the other instruments kind of don't, so even on one note, I have quite a bit of flexibility there just by lipping pitches. So that means that I have to be listening more acutely. Those pitches might not lock in the same way that they do on the clarinet or on the saxophone. Recommendations, there it is again, long tones and scales. We don't usually do harmonics on oboe. The Barrett method is a good starting point if you're looking for oboe material. And the etudes that are in there are really great for any woodwind instrument, and they're really great studies in phrasing. So even just getting the Barrett oboe method and playing it on clarinet is a wonderful thing to do. So equipment for oboe, you really should start with a handmade American scrape reed. So what does that mean? Oboe reeds come in two styles. There's American scrape and European scrape. Obviously, in this country, we really only play American scrape. It's hard to work in America playing a European scrape reed. It's just a different sound concept. And handmade is really important. So you can go to your local music store and buy a reed for, somewhere in the range of $10 to $12. But it's probably not going to support you who's considering trying to play oboe outside of a student realm. So to develop good habits and have something that's really going to support you playing in public, I would just start with directly with a handmade reed. Um, I also don't think that Legers, these guys right here, are a good option for flute or for oboe as well. They are only in European scrape right now, so they get a little bit wild sounding. So how do you do that? How do you get a handmade reed? So most places where you live, you'll be able to find a local reed maker, whether it's a university professor or an advanced university student or an orchestral player. And handmade reeds are not that much more expensive. That's why I can really recommend it. That if you go to the music store, you might get like the thing I don't recommend, a Jones reed or something like that for $10 or $12. But a handmade reed like this may just only cost you 15 or 20. So not a huge increase in cost for a big payoff. The good thing about finding someone local is you can, of course, when it's safe to sit down with that person face to face, and they can hear you, they can hear the oboe you're playing on, they can customize the reeds for you. You can kind of explain to them, well, how things feel and what you like. And it's just really good to have a relationship with a local reed maker, an actual person, if you're going to be playing oboe a lot. You can also ask them for tips on how to adjust their reeds. So if it changes over the life of the reed. And it's a good idea, even if you're not making reeds, to have a really great reed knife. And this might be different than the knife that you use for clarinet. An oboe reed knife is usually called double hollow ground, and that means that it's sloped on both sides. And double reed knives need to be kept much sharper than single reed knives, so having it sharpened regularly is important. Um, in a lot of cases, when you're playing oboe in a pit, you're mic'd. You're playing in a microphone, and this is a different ball game than playing in an orchestra or a concert band or something like that. So the good news is you can get away with a much softer reed, and if you're working with a local reed maker, you can just say like, "Hey, I'm going to be playing into a microphone, so I can take a lighter reed," and they can help you with that. Um, Other sources, if you can't find someone locally, a few websites here that sell really great handmade reeds, I can really recommend. And if you're really going to get into it, it's not a bad idea to learn how to make reeds. So this was something that I did in school, and it's just a good experience to know how the reed works. Many people who double professionally don't continue to make reeds because it's so time consuming, but at least you have knowledge of how to do it to fall back on in an emergency or if you need to adjust something or something like that. So the concern with getting a handmade reed on oboe, which is really important, is less of a case with English horn. So your sort of store-bought English horn reeds, the Jones brand and things like that, are actually work quite well. So an oboe reed is very small, and the blades of cane are very thin, actually thinner than a human hair. So it's just hard to get a machine that will create something to the level that you would want as a professional or aspiring professional on oboe. And the English horn reeds are thicker, so it's not such a big deal. Also really important to get a good case if you're going to buy all these nice reeds. So the sort of plastic boxes and things that reeds sometimes come in are really not great. The best thing to get is something called a ribbon style reed case. There are different styles, but a ribbon style reed case has a ribbon running across the middle that has spots to tuck the reed into. And then as far as instruments, I think synthetic instruments are the way to go for doublers. As clarinetists, I think we're kind of predisposed to thinking that, like, as a serious clarinetist, I should have a wood clarinet. That's something we all aspire to. That's less of a case with oboists. A lot of times professionals will still play on synthetic instruments, whether it's a plastic or a green line, or at the very least, a plastic top joint. So cracking is much more of a concern on oboes than other woodwinds. And playing in pits means that you're going to be playing in places that are probably pretty cold, pretty hot, pretty humid, pretty dry. You might be in some more extreme conditions. And you may not be playing your oboe regularly depending on the kind of work you're doing. So the amount of upkeep and the special attention that a wood oboe needs is usually not worth it for a doubler. Um, and sometimes even for like a professional orchestral oboist. So I really recommend plastic or plastic top joint oboes by Fox, Yamaha, or this one here is by Yosef. Next up is bassoon. Let me get my bassoon. So again, bassoonists can be hard to find in musical theater. Even during this COVID time, there was just an opening for clarinet and bassoon for an Asian tour of The Sound of Music. And they posted it twice, which means they must not have been able to find anyone, which is surprising. So having double reed skills is a good one. The posture, hand position, and balance of bassoon is totally different. And this is the only one where we're reading bass and tenor clef. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The fingerings are also very different and quite complicated. And again, we have a matter of reeds to deal with. It's going to have some of the similar benefits to your clarinet playing as playing oboe. It requires your embouchure to be strong yet flexible, and you have to be really aware of pitch, right? So on any one single note, I have a lot of flexibility there, so that just demands that I listen really carefully. Recommendations, again, long tones, scales with the drone. The Weissenborn method is kind of the go-to for beginning bassoon or even intermediate bassoon. And things to buy, I think the Leger reeds for bassoon are actually quite good, and so do a lot of professionals. There are even full-time orchestral bassoonists who use these, and they're much more common to find among professionals than the Leger oboe reeds. The drawback is cost. They are, around $130 per reed, but they're really stable and they do sound nice. For bassoon and supporting the instrument, a seat strap is traditional. So you may have saw when I sat down that I put this strap down underneath myself before I sat, and that tension that I'm sitting on the strap supports the weight of the instrument and keeps it upright. There's really a lot of benefits to this, and this is what most full-time bassoonists do. It's not great for people who are doubling. So a seat strap is good for your posture and ergonomic, but it doesn't support quick changes very well. It's hard to take the bassoon on and off the seat strap. So for doubling, I really recommend a neck strap. Even though it's sort of less traditional, it supports quick changes much faster than a seat strap does. And then plastic bassoons, again, kind of like oboes can be great. Plastic or wood bassoons by Fox and Yamaha. All right, so now we get to some more interesting stuff. You notice I said in Big Point 5 there, the same principles lead to different techniques. And this ties back to the last bold one I had about ways that playing all these different instruments can kind of help your clarinet playing or feed off of one another. So no matter which instrument you're playing, control starts with the diaphragm, right? So we all learn about embouchure, we all learn about articulation, we all learn about so many important things on the clarinet or any other instrument, but it's all going to come back to breathing. No matter which instrument you're on, the more control you have over your diaphragm, the more you're able to control your breath, the better off you'll be. Another important principle is to use only the muscles you need and no more. So having really good body awareness and maintaining relaxation is going to help you on any instrument. That we do have to engage certain muscles, but we don't want to go outside that. So things that are, creeping into our shoulders and our neck and different areas of our face are usually working against us. For all woodwinds, a healthy embouchure relies on the lips and face and not the jaw. What do I mean by that? So our jaw, of course, hinges right here, can open and close, and there is a form of control there. Like if I close down my jaw, I can control the reed. But that's going to build in tension here. That's going to mess with our pitch. That's going to do a lot of things that we don't want. Having well-developed muscles here while we hold the jaw open is going to help us on any instrument. A good sound is an in-tune sound. Again, that's pretty universal. Keeping pitch first is going to help you kind of guide you towards making your best tone, and aiming to play with your best tone across the entire range at any dynamic. That's sort of a basic principle of all woodwind playing, that we wouldn't expect one register to sound very different, or playing at a softer dynamic or louder dynamic to produce a different quality of sound. And then the last one is audiation will lead you. So audiation is being able to hear music internally in your head. The stronger you are at this skill, the more it will support you on any instrument, especially an unfamiliar one, actually. And then the next bold one, how to compartmentalize. Like, how do I start developing a sensibility for each individual instrument and hopefully not confuse them too much, or not, like people will say, like, not damage my clarinet playing. So probably the most important thing is to listen to recordings. Again, we want to be able to audiate. We want to be able to hear music in your head. So the more developed sound concept you have for each instrument, the better. So we live at a time that you can hear the most amazing professionals of any instrument anytime you want. And it's just such a great way to develop your sense of sound on each instrument. When you're starting out to double, short practice sessions are most effective. So that can sometimes even mean 5 or 10 minutes just on each instrument as you're getting to know this new secondary instrument. Ways to sort of check in on each instrument are just with the top part of each instrument. So if I am pressed for time, or I just need a little refresher sort of about what makes a clarinet and what makes a flute, and so on, these kinds of things, playing on the mouthpiece and barrel, playing on just the head joints, and finding your characteristic sound. Is really helpful. So having a good handle on those things. My other favorite trick for this, sort of helping me compartmentalize and make these differences, is a coffee straw. So the coffee straw, like these little skinny straw that we would get at Starbucks or something, is sort of home base for clarinet. That if I can blow and finger like that, that's going to help me find that nice, consistent, and high voicing I want on my clarinet. So even if you're not doubling, I think this is a great thing. But especially if you kind of need to like remind yourself of good clarinet voicing. There's a basic warm-up that I like for every instrument. And maybe I'll do the flute version, why not? But just, again, to kind of check in with each one, is just do some long tones, starting with wherever my first finger is. So on clarinet, first finger and thumb, this would be E. On saxophone and oboe and flute, this would be B. On bassoon, it actually would also be E. And I'm just going to slur. Increasing the interval down by a half step each time. Practicing attacks is a really important thing as well. The way that each instrument responds a little bit different, and just simply practicing how I want things to start is really useful when we're trying to find our way on each individual one. Reflecting on these things is really important. So having trying to develop an awareness of your body and figure out like, well, what was I doing to make that work on the flute versus what was I doing to make that work on the clarinet? And then keeping a journal is probably the best thing. So keeping notes of, it felt like this on the flute and it felt like that on the clarinet, or I need to remember to do this or do that other thing. So I have been talking so much information. I have a little bit more to say, but I could open it up for some questions just as a little break.
Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Sammy, you can go ahead and ask.
Yeah, so you talked a lot about those Leger synthetic reeds, and I don't know if you know, but how would you recommend someone go about finding the right strength of reed for like a sax, or really any of them?
Right. So it probably will take some trial and error, to be honest. And the Leger has historically been really good about return policy. So if you go to their website, they'll have a size charts to compare it to like popular cane reeds. And so you'll want to pick the closest one based on that size chart and then know that if you do need to return it, you probably can. In times when we weren't, dealing with COVID, occasionally music stores would keep trial ones on hand that you could actually try and then would be sanitized. So if you can find a place like that, that might work too. I found that even though they're expensive, as I got more into it, I kind of just developed like a collection of Legers, because the different strengths sometimes come in handy in different settings. If you're in a bigger room or a smaller room, it can sound very different. And you can also adjust them. So if you get this device called the Reed Geek, I don't know if you've seen it, that works for cane reeds, that actually also works for Legers if you're careful. And I wouldn't recommend using a knife or sandpaper on Legers, but a Reed Geek can work really well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, good question.
You will be sending us this outline, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. I will send it out to everyone as well. I just had someone ask.
Yeah, of course.
Tell me a little bit about when you started picking these instruments up and what was the most challenging one for you as a clarinetist?
Ooh. So I think definitely flute was the most challenging. That for me, it was a journey, kind of like I said, of figuring out all the places that clarinet was allowing me to stay tense, or I was just being a tense clarinet player and getting by. And the flute would kind of shut down on me. And it would be really frustrating, actually, that I was relying on trying to manipulate the sound in ways that were tense rather than relying on my breathing. And so being able to kind of relate that principle back to clarinet ended up being really helpful. I started on clarinet kind of young. I was 8, I think, when I got my clarinet. And then I just always really liked instruments. I think it was more about owning instruments more than it was playing music for me, especially at that age. So I got a flute, and these were like really cheap used instruments, a couple years later. And then when it was finally time to join band, like in 5th or 6th grade, I wanted something different because I had been playing clarinet for a couple years and flute for a year. So I got a bassoon. And then I played bassoon all through high school. But you can't really play bassoon in marching band or pep band, so that's when I picked up saxophone. And then kind of went back to getting serious about clarinet just my last year of high school, when I thought, like, well, what do I really want to play going off to college? Then, like I mentioned, I was sort of forbidden to double in college, which at least for a time was probably good for me. I have to say that I don't know if I would have learned some things that had I been sort of scattering my efforts. But then once I finished undergrad, opportunities started to come up where someone would say, like, oh, I've got a studio of clarinet students, but there's a couple sax students. Do you mind? Like these kinds of things. Or, there's a gig coming and most of the tunes are on clarinet, but there's one thing that's on flute. Do you think you can? And so these things kept coming up. And so I felt like I need to start investing in them more. So during my master's is when I started trying to like get my hands on some instruments, borrow instruments, is what I did for a long time. Um, and then play for colleagues, you know, like really take lessons with other grad students, or local professionals, to try and see like how far I could take it. And that's when I started noticing that, it was challenging and at times frustrating, but I was able to make a little more money. And I started, like I said, noticing things that were helping me with clarinet. I started noticing ways that I was approaching clarinet, um, that could be helped by the way I approached another instrument.
Thank you. Yeah, any other questions? We have another one. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course.
This is also a random question. So you mentioned you've doubled flute a lot. Have you been expected to play piccolo as well?
Yeah, yeah. So be ready. Um, yeah, the good news is piccolos tend to be less expensive and there's not a big demand for you to have like the most fabulous piccolo, but it comes up. Kiss Me Kate, I think there was definitely piccolo in that. Shrek the musical had some piccolo. Um, there might be some piccolo in My Fair Lady, so it definitely comes up for sure.
Any other questions? Cool. All right.
Cool. So if everyone has time, I can forge ahead, wrap up my little outline. Um, so if if you're ready to like actually practically get started, it's a good idea to borrow or rent instruments at first. Like I mentioned, that was my start, was going to colleagues, going to friends, that their saxophone that they had used in marching band, their flute that they had used as a beginner was sitting in a closet, and so they were able to, to lend that to me or let me borrow it or something like that. If you're ready to start, moving forward, I would suggest making really wise investments. So be careful with secondhand instruments, especially eBay, Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, that kind of thing. It's really possible to see an instrument that's not very expensive, but will cost more than the value of it to bring it back up to working order. We don't want to do that. There's really, no need to get like not a great brand of instrument. Again, um, I don't like to be a person that says no and don't explore things. But if you're looking towards playing in public and starting to work, some of the very cheapest instruments from like Amazon and eBay, again, um, just aren't going to suit you. They're not going to help you as a professional. Use the resources around you. If you're going to buy something, why not run it by, the flute professor at your school or someone that you know that plays flute, so you're not making that choice on your own. Reeds, mouthpieces, and head joints make a big deal. So, if you're starting to spend money, maybe a saxophone mouthpiece is the best investment you can make even before the saxophone, because putting a really great saxophone mouthpiece on a not so great saxophone can work out pretty well. As I mentioned before, if you were going to spend a big chunk of change and invest, putting your money into flute is probably the best choice. Um, Even in professional settings, sort of a student saxophone can work out for you. Sometimes even a student oboe can work really well, but a flute, you'll really experience bang for the buck in terms of the sound quality you get out of a more advanced flute. You want to set aside regular time for checking on all these instruments and playing them in. So it would be nice to think that if you're busy doing other things and you're not going to play, say, the oboe for a couple months, that you could put it in its case and not have to deal with it for a while, and then open it up before the next gig. But it's a sad fact that instruments that aren't regularly played do change, that the pads dry out, even on a plastic instrument. So regularly playing something in, even just for a few minutes, is going to help keep it in playing condition. And having humidifiers, especially during these months, is really helpful. Keeping your equipment organized is huge. Once you start getting into shows where you have 3, 4, 5, I think 6 even instruments, um, and you're very busy working, you know, probably teaching a little bit and gigging in the evening, you don't want to be in a place where you go, where are my bari sax reeds? Or where's the tenor sax ligature, right? You want to have things super organized so that you're not hunting down equipment, and duplicates are great. So if you can spring, you know, if you get a great saxophone mouthpiece and you can actually spring for two of them, that's nice, because I think a lot of people have had that experience where your stuff breaks at the gig or right before the gig, and then you're in a rough place. So I always like to keep everything organized, and as much as it's practical, try to have two, or try to have backups of some kind. Keeping a repair kit is really important. So just things like screwdriver, oil, a little bit of Teflon tape that's used by plumbers, and just learning some simple repair things you can do to try and get by. And then I mentioned before, the reed geek is a great thing, because it can be used to adjust those Leger reeds. You want to keep track of your physical health. So times when I've been playing a lot of shows, you know, it might be, say, like an 8 or 12 week run, and there'll be 5 or 6 shows a week. And that's a lot of playing. So you have to make sure that you get rest. You have to make sure that your practicing is really efficient. You keep up with your fundamentals. If you're just in a stage of learning doubles and getting used to it, I would say don't be afraid to start with simple music. You don't have to start with the Nielsen Flute Concerto. You are an advanced musician already, so you can grasp complex music. You're just trying to educate your muscles to make the sounds in a new way. So necessarily trying to play really complicated music might not be a good use of your time. I would spend more time, again, like I said, on the long tones, the harmonics, the scales. Those things will really support you. When you're actually practicing doubles, make sure you take breaks. These are, in some cases, new muscles or muscles being used in a different way. So they're going to need some rest, stretch, and hydrate, and listen to your body. Again, you just have more risk of overuse injury in these kinds of situations, so you want to be really careful. You have to manage your time carefully. Like I said, I suggest starting the day with flute, focusing on long tones, harmonic scales, and just simple finger exercises. When you're trying to manage so many different things, studying your part away from the instrument can be really helpful. So again, working on that skill of audiating can save you some physical wear and tear. Similarly, using your knowledge of music theory, right? So all that theory knowledge that you're developing, scales, chords, arpeggios, different patterns, will support you on any instrument. So that's really great. And the more you can use that, it's to your advantage. And of course, don't neglect your primary instruments in any of this. So all of this was just talking about getting started on these other instruments and some maybe practical advice for working. When you're actually playing a show, and some of you may know this, you actually have to not only be able to play the flute, but be able to play the flute immediately after picking up a clarinet. And sometimes those fast changes can be really disconcerting. So I kind of like to think of that as almost a separate skill. Like, not only can you play the flute, but you can play it in succession after something else. So practice that doubling in context to get used to the feeling of it. If you just, sit down and have a great flute practice session, but don't actually practice playing clarinet, then flute, then saxophone as it is in the parts, it might throw you a little bit on the gig, and that's not fun. Instrument stands, I think, are a must if you're going to work, and planning the layout is super important. I know it's tempting, especially when money's tight, to try, put instruments on a chair or on the floor or something, but it's not advised. And thinking carefully about the layout of the stands in front of you can really help. So as you rehearse or as you practice your part, that can help. I also like to mark my parts in a pretty detailed way. Reminders when I'm changing horns. Reminders when to soak reeds can be huge, right? Because you're playing on a cane reed on oboe, and your oboe may sit dry for a while. So you want to know when's during the start of this piece is when I soak the oboe reed so it's ready for me 2 pieces later. And also marking places to swab out. So in a pit, you're going to have way more condensation. Things tend to get cold. You'll play an instrument for 5 minutes straight, and then it will sit and get cold. and then you'll pick it back up and it'll be full of condensation. So finding spots in the music where you can swab out instruments is really good. Part of the challenge of doubling, in context is keeping an awareness of pitch. So with the exception of bassoon, you're always reading treble clef, but the instruments can transpose very differently. So I think it was Shrek was one that I played, Shrek the musical, where it had both flutes and bari sax in the same book. So you can be reading, say, a G on top of the staff, and that's kind of a high, that's a treble note, that's a high note. But when you pick up the bari sax, that's sounding much, much lower, even though it looks the same. So again, keeping your awareness of pitch and that skill of audiating. If you're getting ready for a particular show, practicing with a cast recording can be really nice. It can be just a nice way to like have your own rehearsal at home. But expect changes in cuts. So different to the way that like a normal, things are run on the concert stage where you tend to play everything exactly on the page. Musicals kind of go through different revisions and different versions, and a cast recording may be different than the rental score, maybe different than the movie recording, maybe different than the version that you end up doing. So you want to keep out for that. Managing conditions in the pits. I never knew the value of a mouthpiece cap until I started playing in pits a lot. It really is a benefit. Mouthpiece caps and leger reeds, because having things dry out when you're doing fast switches is not fun. And then a big one is instrument temperature. So we all learn to tune our instruments a certain way after we've warmed up. We warm up on our clarinet and we, pull out a certain amount, and then we kind of expect it to be stable unless we're in an unusual situation. And this is one of those unusual situations. So you may be playing clarinet quite happily for 10, 20 minutes, and then pick up a flute that's freezing cold, right? It's sitting there. And so you want to keep that in mind, that picking up a cold flute may need to be pushed in more than the way you would normally play, right? So thinking through the sequence of the show and how warm or cold each instrument is going to make a big difference. And the metal instruments, flute and saxophone, will fluctuate more than we're used to even on clarinet. A cold flute or a cold saxophone will play very flat. So it's nice to be able to compensate for that. Sometimes this means you got to get some different stuff. I like to keep a 64 barrel and a 67 barrel, even beyond the normal like 65, 66 that we use, just for those situations when things are really cold or really warm, and I'm trying to find pitch on my clarinet. And being able to mark it again in your part can really help. If I'm playing on my flute and it's gotten quite warm, and then I know it's going to go back on the stand for 15 minutes, I might mark my part to push in, so then I know it's gotten cold, but I've also pushed it in, so it will hopefully have worked itself out. I mentioned this before, develop your understanding of different styles. A lot of times your classical clarinet training will support you in a lot of things, but not everything. So having some working knowledge of jazz is good. Using your colleagues as a resource, playing duets with them, playing for them is good. And working on some kind of related skills that we're sometimes asked to do in pits. Things can change very quickly. Numbers can be taken out, or added in. So being a good sight reader is always to your benefit. Being able to transpose is always a helpful skill. There was one show I did in Chicago where one of the cast members was just a little fickle, and some days they would come in before the show started. The director would say, she has, she's a little tired today, so we're going to take her numbers down a step. So being ready to be able to kind of think on your feet like that is good. And more musical theater scores will call for people to take solos. So having just a basic knowledge of some improv strategies, the blues scale, can help. Some more resources. I really like this book here. It's designed for woodwind methods class, but it's so good and it's so clear on fundamentals of all the woodwinds that this is great for everyone. I mentioned Brett Pimentel in his website. The Woodwind Fingering Guide is also a fantastic website. It's free, and it just has fingerings and trill fingerings and alternate fingerings for all the woodwinds. And then if you're interested in pursuing professional things, the normal sort of trade organizations don't always post these kinds of jobs. So like I was talking about that Asian tour of The Sound of Music, those usually end up on Playbill, if you're looking for a national tour or a job like that. Sometimes regional theaters will also post on Playbill too. So that's my sort of brain dump. Everything I think I can share with you regarding doubling. Thank you for being so patient and staying with me this whole time. I'm happy to take more questions if there are more questions.
Do you mind if I stop sharing the screen?
Oh yeah, sorry.
All right, we did have another one in the chat.
Oh, cool.
What about other auxiliary woodwinds?
Ooh, so you're talking about like English horn and soprano saxophone, that kind of thing?
Let's give him a
Yeah.
yes.
Yes. So that's something that's kind of changed a lot in like the past 20 years. You would almost never see an English horn part, or like somebody else asked about piccolo. Not super common, but orchestrators and composers are getting more demanding all the time. So for sure, I've been asked to play English horn, um, even in books that don't have oboe in it, which is kind of odd. Um, I've definitely been asked to play soprano saxophone and bari sax. Trying to think of anything really wacky. I think I mentioned like recorder for sure. You'll see recorder in shows sometimes, or different kinds of like tin whistles and things too. Um, so yeah, not a bad thing to have in mind. Do you have to own all those things? No. So if for some reason you were asked to play English horn, there are ways to rent them that it can be cost effective depending on how many shows you have.
Do you have a favorite show you've ever played?
Ooh. Favorite show. I really, really like, I think my favorite show of all time is A Chorus Line.
Oh, okay.
And not often done anymore. So if you don't know A Chorus Line, check it out.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
And try and see the real show if you can, or find a video of the show. I don't really love the movie. They made a movie in like 1987 or something. It's not the same.
Yeah. Are there any, maybe this is a terrible question. You can plead the fifth, but are there any memorable mishaps in a pit that you were able to get through with this knowledge?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's really kind of the point of it, is so many of these are from memorable mishaps. I can share stories. So one thing that I usually do, of course, not during COVID times, is a festival in New York. It's called the Festival of the Voice, and it's this big festival of like opera and musical theater. And I did it a couple summers ago. I actually went. I took a vacation in Europe and had this great time. And I didn't get a chance to see the parts for this festival until like really a few days before, which I don't recommend, but it's sometimes a reality. Uh, and I came back from Europe and I was very ill. I had gotten so digestively ill on this trip, and they wanted me to play a lot of piccolo in that show. And so that was a test. So I made it through, but that was a tough one. Definitely things breaking. Um, Having backups of ligatures and things is great because it's just kind of embarrassing when things break. And definitely swabbing out. It seems like such a silly thing, but it can be just so embarrassing to have water in your horn. You know, you're there to make the singers and the actors look and sound amazing and to support them. And sometimes you get a little moment, um, you get a little riff or something, and if it doesn't go well, it's kind of a letdown. And sometimes just having water in the horn and not swabbing out, almost obsessively swabbing out, is key.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
So when you're like applying for these jobs on Playbill, what sort of qualifications are they looking for? Like, is there a certain level of degree that they ask you for, or I'm just curious.
No, so for something like if you're looking at like a national tour or something like that, they want to hear samples. So they always want to hear audio samples, if not video samples, of your playing and different styles. So like a little classical clarinet is fine, but they definitely want to hear like, can you do something more in a, hard rock or blues or whatever on saxophone and things like that. Um, so even practicing like musical theater excerpts, like we sometimes practice um, orchestral excerpts, can be really, really good. And experience. I think that's probably the next thing is not so much the degree, but just that you've done a lot of shows, that you've like, played a lot. And that's, I think, a really good piece of advice too, is if you're interested, really take every opportunity, even if it's not something that you really aspire to yet, it's building really great experience. So community theater where you live now, student productions where you live now, and treat it like it's a professional job. And that can really do a lot for you. You'll learn so much by expecting a high level of yourself, where you are now, what's available to you now.
All right, last call for questions. I'm sure I'll think of more. If you do think of some, feel free to email me and I'll forward them on and get some responses. But this has been really informative. This was great for anyone who wants to be a professional doubler, but also for people who are, teaching music ed. Understanding how to compartmentalize is just so helpful. So we thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for coming in. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, Dr. Yandl. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I
Right.
think it was so wonderful to speak to all of you and answer your questions as I could. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions, and just such a pleasure to work with you all. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good. Thank you. That was so helpful. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay. Cool. Do you want me to